Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our online art conversations here at Rosa. We've got two very special guests that will be joining me today. First, I'd like to introduce Eric Moore. Eric Moore is a cellist who specializes in new classical music. He is adjunct faculty at Pacific Union College, and he is a composer who maintains a private studio of 20 cello students. Eric collaborated with the Rosa Center for Contemporary Art last year for our Viola Fry exhibition, where he and Jennifer Hunt, a flutist, played musical selections that were responding to the work of Viola Fry. So I'd like us to welcome Eric.
Hi, Hugo. Thanks so much for having us today. And that was a great introduction. A little bit more about me. The ensemble that I have that focuses on new works of classical music, lots of premieres and that sort of thing, is called New Music Decanted, which is newmusicdecanted.org. And we play throughout North Bay and give about 30 shows a year. So that's keeping me pretty busy at this point.
Our second guest is Pete Davies. He is a multi-instrumentalist rock musician based out of Napa. He's been active in the local music scene for a long time, playing in various bands. Most recently, his project is a group called Kowa, and he actually DJ'd at one of our Third Thursdays DeRosa events back in 2018, and we're hoping to have him back at DeRosa in person soon. So welcome, Pete.
Hi, how's it going? Thanks for having me, Hugo. I have a project called Kowa with my good friend Robinson Kuntz, and we just released an EP called Play It Again, and we've also been working on some music videos and other things like that, making use of video editing software and learning that kind of stuff since there's a little bit of extra time with quarantine. But yeah, our new EP is on all the kind of streaming services online, or you can purchase it at Kowa. That's KOWA.bandcamp.com. That's it.
All right, so here we are all together. To break the ice a little bit, I do have a question that we can just answer real quickly to get used to talking to each other and learn a little bit more about each other and our relationship to art. Could you describe the last experience you've had at a gallery or a museum? What was the last gallery or museum that you went to? And just real quick, what was that like? Eric, go ahead.
Just before the quarantine stuff happened, I was actually in France, and so the last one that I went to was the Louvre, which was not a bad one to have done. And the Louvre is, of course, so overwhelming, and you only have a couple minutes to look at anything because there's just so much. So it was the Louvre, and it was put on blinders, walk through 17 rooms, see the one thing, put on blinders again.
Yeah, it's like hit all those important spots. Yeah.
Yeah.
You gotta have a map, everything you want to go to see. Okay.
Yep. Exactly.
Right. Pete, how about you?
I was trying to think if I've been to any since I've been back in the States. I went to Guatemala for about a month this summer, and I not any one spot sticks out to me, but I went to a lot of churches and like religious sites in mostly Antigua, Guatemala, that have had lots of like religious iconography and historical paintings and things like that. But I can't think of anything in quite a bit, to be honest, that has any modern art or anything like that.
Sure, right on. Okay, kind of two very different experiences. All right. So for anyone who's not familiar with DeRosa, today we're going to be looking at an artwork that's located at DeRosa. DeRosa is maybe not your typical sort of museum or gallery type of space, in that we do have two gallery buildings, but then we have a large property that showcases dozens of outdoor sculptures. So today one of those works is what we're going to be talking about. So this is also meant to be kind of emulating the experience of being at DeRosa and the way that we would lead a conversation. So we're going to go ahead and start by looking at a slideshow of this one work, and we're going to take a minute and do some slow looking. So why don't we go through it, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we see. Okay, so and I'm just going to kind of scroll through it and see a few different views here.
Trying to put on my best thoughtful observation face right now.
Right. It's these considerations that you don't necessarily have in person, right? Being recorded.
Right.
Okay. First one. Okay, so why don't we just kind of go through and first tell me what you observed about this piece. What about the materials, about the construction, even about the sighting? Really, it's where our guests want to take this conversation, but those are just kind of some examples of things to consider. So what are some things that you observed about this piece?
Well, I think...
Oh, go ahead.
I think one of the things that always hits me about sculpture is how much the materials make a difference. And so, first of all, imagining what the materials feel like from afar, right? Because we all know the feeling of that brick stone. You can imagine the grittiness of it. And then just like you're cycling through it, it's the thing that always strikes me about sculpture as an observer, like being there, is I try to walk around the entire thing and observe it kind of from all sides. Because in the first shot, it looks like it's all a single block, right?
Yeah.
And then it turns out that there's more to it than that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my initial reaction upon that first shot was, it's one fully conical, cylindrical type of shape. And it actually reminded me of, I don't know, I don't want to give it away because I don't think it's on public property, but there's a spot here in town that has something similar to that that's about, I would guess, maybe 15 feet tall. That the origins from talking to people are kind of unknown, but it has it's like that, but there's a little entrance on two sides that you can crawl through, and it's like a smokehouse.
Oh, wow.
But it's built construction, the way it looks, it's overgrown with moss and things like that now, but it looks very, very similar to that initial view.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what I initially thought. It made me think of some kind of like kiln or something you would like cook something in. And then on a totally different note, one of the views of that top shape, this is so gonna make me sound so dorky, but it reminded me of like guns in Star Wars. It reminded me of like a gun turret from like a Star Destroyer or something like that. So
Totally.
Just to bring down the high-mindedness of this conversation, the Star Wars fan thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot going on there. That's one of the difficult things about doing something like this online is sculpture really changes as you walk around it, especially a sculpture like this, as you see, gets much more complex as you're pointing out. The shapes kind of change. You start to recognize it differently. And that's interesting, Pete, that it reminds you. So the piece that you're saying it reminds you of, is it a functional object like a silo, or is it also an artwork?
I think at one time it was a functional object. At this point, I don't think very many people even know it exists.
Mm.
But I, it's so old that and it's not in like a more heavily traveled site. It's not like the grist mill valley where like tourists are coming and checking it out and they're reading placards. It's really like right when quarantine started and I was like, where's every spot I can go in Napa that I know about? I checked it out and it was like overgrown with moss, but it's not an art object in the traditional sense, you know,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
it was built for a function. It's just not 100% clear what that was,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
it's open at the top, so it was clearly this thing that, you know, smoke was meant to rise from the top and
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
almost like a teepee, but clearly meant to like withstand heat.
Right on.
Now it's just overgrown with moss and other uh, like bushes and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. So you guys haven't gotten any information about this piece. I sent you a few of these photos before, but you don't know who did this piece, what it's called. So why don't we go ahead and find out what the title is? So this is a piece by an artist named Alan Shepp. He's based in the city of Napa, originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and the piece is called Orfeo. The name, if you notice, is a reference to Greek mythology, the Greek myth of Orpheus, right? It's from 1995, and the materials are actually this Texas pink granite and volcanic gneiss. Okay, so now that you have a little more information, how does that, change your perception of this piece, or does it?
Well, in
Well,
this case, go ahead.
immediately knowing that he's a local artist does make me think like I wonder if he has seen that thing I'm talking about. But that's what initially came to mind.
Well, yeah, in this case, it's interesting that it's specifically Texas pink granite, so that makes me have some questions about the material a little bit, and if there was a long drive involved in getting that here or whatever. But that makes me think a lot more about the space within the base part of it, right? Because it's the underworld and it's not looking backwards, and so having a very clear and you know pointed shape emerging, like you said, like Star Wars cannons from the top. I don't know, with two of them that could be representational of the two people, the two characters, or it could be but either way, it's I'm thinking more about the walk and not looking back, and those parts of the myth.
Yeah. So, for anyone who doesn't know the story of Orpheus, Orpheus was a kind of very talented musician in Greek mythology whose music could move, animals, people, gods, and eventually he gets married to a wood nymph named Eurydice, and she unfortunately passes away, and so he goes and travels to the underworld to bring her back, to plead his case to Hades, to Persephone, to bring her back. And as you're saying, this idea of not turning back, that was a catch. He could take her back, but he wasn't allowed to look back at her along the way, not until they were out of the underworld. So that's interesting that you're saying that the structure of the shape, that it might remind you of that journey, but even the shape on top, right? The symbolism for like two people and unity.
Right. Also, the O, Orpheus, and then pointing kind of like upward and outward, like kind of goes along with that idea of not looking back. Yeah, that's good.
And then the materials. You have questions about the materials. Our label there, it's very specific with this Texas pink granite. Do you think the color or this material, how does it add to your interpretation of this piece?
Well, since Orpheus has journeyed to the underworld is hell, and so whether the volcanic part of it is definitely hell, and depending on your views on Texas, that could be considered hell. So,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Pete, go ahead.
No, yeah. I don't have a whole lot to say on that, but I like that interpretation.
Yeah. Um, so those are kind of some ideas of what this piece might mean.
What's up with the two little um,
Notches.
like divots? Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's interesting.
So as we look more closely, Eric, you had pointed out the texture, especially with sculpture, how important it is. So we see kind of this rough volcanic rock at the base, but then if we go up top, this rock is maybe a little bit smoother, maybe a little more polished, but we still see kind of these gouges on the side there. And that there's also kind of these levels going on with the shape up top. So it's not it almost looks like it's put together. It's definitely been worked. From the front there, we see it's almost like it's been broken off. So a little bit more about the artist. So Alan Shepp has been working specifically in stone, like focusing on stone for a long time now. So materials are very, very important. Sourcing of materials. At DeRosa, we have a few other works by him. Most notably, in our meadow, we have 4 kind of structures that he titled the poetry houses, and they're all made out of different slate, like different colored slate. So we can imagine that the materials are very important to him to source them. As you said, it's probably traveled really far, and hey, maybe it is a reference to traveling to the underworld, or that idea of sourcing your materials, having them travel just like in the story. Okay. So I'm wondering, what about this? So this shape, it's interesting. These your kind of interpretations of it, the O for Orpheus, kind of the symbolism that you're getting out of it. Does it remind you of any objects that you've seen or recognized?
Well, I was curious if that sort of symbol meant anything like specifically, like that kind of O with the lines off of it, or if that is something that he sort of designed himself. Like, is that a symbol that has any kind of inherent meaning on its own? Because I like in Greek mythology or Greek, like, I don't know the Greek alphabet that well, if there's anything that
Right.
looks like that, but yeah.
And I am reminded a little bit of a ring, which would be, unity, kind of like you were alluding to earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. So there could be a lot of different interpretations of it, and I think that's what's great about artwork. And I think what we really want to stress at DeRosa is, as much as an artist may have had a message, they could write you a whole book. Sometimes they don't want to tell you anything. What they had in mind when they're making the piece. Ultimately, it's our interaction. It's the everyday interactions with the artwork and interpretations that I think that continue. So that's interesting that you're kind of getting these senses of unity, of bonds through this piece. I don't know too much about the Greek alphabet either. It almost does look like a letter, right? But it could also be many things, right? One thing that I have a suspicion is that it might be a lyre, like the instrument, like the little harp.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe a reference to that.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
I like that.
So, since now that we're a little bit more familiar with the artist, we're a little bit more familiar with the story of Orpheus, what do you think the artist is trying to say with this piece? Or what is he saying to you with this piece?
Ooh.
Now take a second. Take some consideration. Or not. again, it's really interesting, the sort of emotions or ideas that you can get from an art piece. It doesn't necessarily need to tell you a story. Maybe it makes you feel a certain way. Maybe you don't like it. Maybe you think it's awesome. Maybe it reminds you of a structure, right? And maybe it still reminds you of the structure that exists, this utilitarian thing out of history, out of time.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I don't know, like thinking about this like traveling that Orpheus does, if the columns are somehow like meant to represent some sort of obstacle or like the journey, like because they're kind of rough, they're sort of like they're kind of in the way, and it just, yeah, I don't know, in within that it's darker, right? It's like a little the path is more obscured, whereas from looking out, like it's like pointing in a very clear direction.
Oh, sure.
And funny enough, earlier on in the season, Jennifer Hunt, who you mentioned, played a piece by Thea Musgrave called Orfeo. And she, see, I don't remember the myth deeply enough, but there were 6 separate places on the stage where she was supposed to travel. And in counting, there are 6 levels to the stones, right? I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I wonder if each of those has something to do with the like the different whatever levels of circles of hell, or that's Dante, but yeah. I wonder if there's something in that.
Okay.
But the thing that kind of strikes me about it is that it's not, I don't know, it's not lined up. Like there isn't a from that side, the top goes off to the right, and the thing goes underneath it.
Yeah.
And so there's something about, like, I don't know, diverging paths or something like that. Like they weren't, right, they were both walking one direction, but then this other thing happened, and so she gets taken back, and, it's tragic, and I don't know.
Kind of this not this angle, kind of lopsidedness, it does speak
right.
to the different paths, the diverging paths that they take. Okay.
One of the things that I think about a lot with art, and I mean with visual art specifically, as opposed to like music and stuff, is that that if someone has gone to like see a concert, they sit there for the duration of the show, or or whatever. But like with art, like I was saying with the Louvre, you have to put on blinders and go from one thing to the next, and you don't have to take all this time necessarily and like stop and observe. And so going back to your question of what strikes you, each time I take another pass through the photos or learn something new, it's like I'm having to sit there and think about it more and more, instead of just, seeing it, being like, what's that? And then moving on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know, this one, the more we dive into it, the more I like it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like as is the case with a lot of art, the longer you look at it, you realize the number of choices that are more than likely intentional, versus like just passing through. You're like, oh, you built a little cylindrical thing and put a thing on top, and you're like, yeah, that's cool, but I don't know what it, and then yeah, like you're talking about the 6 different layers, just yeah, I mean every choice may have been a very conscious effort, and I think art is really interesting in that way, that certain choices can be led just by intuition and being in the moment and the feeling, or even just like what you have in front of you. Sometimes, like if, again, to go back to a musical comparison, like the choice you make when you have like a synthesizer in front of you versus a snare drum, and what direction that leads you, and what your relation is to those things and your expertise with them, and that's going to dictate something, and it's not necessarily it's not always like, okay, I'm going to create this piece of art, like from square one, you're like, okay, I'm going to talk about Greek mythology. Maybe that's a decision that's made halfway through the process. Maybe it's from the start. Maybe it's, in some cases, you derive meaning from your own art after it's done, like, and I think that's the really interesting thing. And also that kind of goes to, like, as a viewer, in some cases, you as an artist are essentially assigning meaning in not that different of a way than the viewer is. You're not necessarily some authority figure.
Yeah.
Like, someone might be like, what's this mean? And you're like, well, like, I don't know. I kind of figured it out afterward. And then I just kind of put the pieces together, and this is what makes sense to me. But, I mean, again, I don't know what the story of the creation of this is, but I think that there's always this, like, balance between everything being absolutely intentional and thoughtful to the nth degree, and then also just, like, going off of intuition. And it's kind of like there's this back and forth. And so I think that's kind of interesting when looking at something like this, wondering where the artist was in like which mindset or what process he was going about creating this.
And about the process, this one, and I assume probably stone materials just generally, it's not like a painting where the artist could have started, anywhere on the canvas, right? Very clearly, he had to have started at the bottom and built up. So there's a little bit about the process of making it that's involved in this piece too, right?
Well, I did want to, kind of to bring this conversation full circle and Pete, I think you touched a lot on.
Oh, geez, sorry. I'm in an office.
No worries. That's okay. We'll cut this part out, or we'll fast forward it.
All right, guys.
One of the last videos I did for DeRosa, my neighbors were out messing with the trash cans. It was really loud, and so I kept that in my video, and I just had it on fast forward, like loud neighbor noises.
Right.
Sorry, I'm in an office that has devices that are not mine, and I don't know how they work. Apologies.
No worries. But Pete, I think you started to talk about it, and you kind of dove into it quite a bit. But to kind of turn it back on you, so now that we've kind of discovered more about this piece, for ourselves, how can you relate to the process of whether it's art making with the art that you make, or to the emotions maybe portrayed in this piece? How can you find a way to relate this back to your own personal experience?
Oh man, I mean, I can, in the sense of like trying to tell a story with it. I mean, okay. Well, this is a piece about a musician, and this, seemingly a piece about this musician, and sort of in going with this idea of this journey from the underworld. I mean, I don't know. If I wanted to really extend myself and just kind of like go on a flight of fancy, I mean, if you think about this idea of like, okay, in order to save your love, you have to like keep moving forward, not looking back. In the creative process, there's a lot of time for self-reflection, and I think personally, I think sometimes the enemy of good art, for myself at least, can be when you try and work on things to the nth degree and keep going back and keep changing, and you're like, I could make that better, I could make that different. And then when you don't just keep looking ahead and moving forward, sometimes what happens is you just totally took the life out of the thing you were creating. Like, it just becomes this, all the quirks and all the kind of like flaws that existed are gone, and it doesn't have the same human quality to it. But again, that's if I'm really like going for it.
Eric, your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, I like that a lot. Because definitely, I mean, Orpheus as a musician, like you said, at some point you just got to ship the work, right? And not worry about those little tiny imperfections to the nth degree. So when you said that, it made me think about the smoothness versus the textured part of the rock, and it made me think about loss, right? Because Orpheus is fundamentally about losing someone and being hung up on that person, right? And looking back and having that be a tragic thing. Yeah, so moving forward and shipping art and doing all of those sorts of things, kind of like you said, is exactly where I was on it. So,
Okay. All right. Well, we've gotten a chance to talk about a lot of different aspects of this work. Is there anything that we didn't get a chance to talk about? Anything else, or maybe that you wonder or is unresolved?
I mean, that's the thing with art is I like I I always kind of want to know more, and sometimes that's not always the best thing, you know. Like if you know so much about the creator of the art or the story behind it, some people would argue that, you know, sometimes it loses a little bit of the magic or whatever. I tend to like to know, but so I mean, I'm interested in Alan Shepp. What's his story? What's his perspective? What's his other art like? How does this piece exist in relation to the other things he's done? And what's his process like? All that stuff. To me, I always feel like as a creative person, in particular, and I can't speak for those who maybe are not. I mean, everyone has their kind of artistic endeavor in some respect, but you know, I'm always trying to like unlock the key. You know,
Yeah.
you know. Oh God, I'm like veering into other Greek mythology, right? I'm trying to like find the fire of the gods. You know, like it's like I want to know because I want it for myself. You know, I'm like looking for any insight I can find. But also sometimes, you know, like you get the deeper meaning from that, and like with, I don't know, there's some good podcasts now that do that where they just like really go deep on music, and dissect a song and the lyrics and the instrumental choices and the key changes and every little thing. And sometimes it can be a slog in the wrong hands, but other times you're like, oh my God, like this song that I just kind of bobbed my head to is now this thing that I understand on a really deep level. And yeah, I think I like being able to appreciate it in both regards, but I'm interested to know more.
Okay. Before moving on from that point, Pete, I will turn it back around on you. How do you feel if someone comes up and asks you about your art, about your music, and wants to know and dissect it? How do you feel that as an artist, as a creator of that music or that piece?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of tend to be, as far as the creation of something, I'm happy to talk about it, happy to share. I don't necessarily know that people always want to know all those details for someone on my level of notoriety, but um, you know, I'm happy to talk about it. I kind of like the idea of demystifying the process personally. Um, but at the same time, I think there's always the risk of depriving people of their own interpretation, you know, like by sharing, particularly with things like lyrics and stuff like that. It's I'm happy to talk about it, but you know, you also kind of run this thing like, oh no, actually that's wrong. This is the right thing. And I don't think that's really what art's about. You're like, oh, okay, that's what you think. Great. I mean, there are times when you're like, oh no, yeah, no, the song is not a commentary on like the current political situation. This is actually about a girl I broke up with or something like that. But it's like, whatever, have your meaning. But yeah, I tend to like, I like talking about that stuff. I think I probably like talking about it more than anyone else though. So
yeah. Eric, your thoughts either on that, or is there anything else that you'd like us to talk about in regards to this piece?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like Pete was saying, it's interesting on the one hand to talk about your own process. Maybe it has more to do with who's asking. In my case, right? Because when I'm playing a concert, no one wants to hear about how I practiced it. I mean, like, no one cares, right? Because that's, like, who cares? When I'm composing, people might be more interested in, like, why did you choose to do this in this section or whatever. So if you're talking to the audience, then, yeah, just let them do with it what they want. Whatever they got out of the experience was the right thing for them to get. If you're talking to a cello student or a composition student or something like that, then maybe talking a little bit more about, the materials or the process or whatever has its place. But yeah, it's at some level, there's the Robert Rauschenberg thing where, a visual artist would just put the stuff there and in the middle of the gallery, and unbeknownst to the people around, they'd be saying, well, obviously the chicken represents death and and all of these things, and that wasn't what he wanted in his particular case. He would just walk up and start laughing, or walk up and start crying, or whatever, to say get out of your head a little bit and just experience it, because I made all those choices so that you wouldn't have to think about them. I don't know. I go back and forth on those sides of art a lot, so whatever helps the observer get out of it the most that they can get, without, like Pete was saying, depriving it of all meaning, is probably the balance that we should all be looking for.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to go ahead and play you out. Why don't you go ahead and just take a little bit of time to tell us about any upcoming projects, where we can find your music, where we can see you perform, anything you'd like to share with us. So we'll start with Eric.
Well, thanks so much for having us. It was a lot of fun today. And let me see. The big thing is we've been doing weekly concerts. newmusicdecanted.org/live-video, and it sounds like there will be some links in the show notes or something. But we've been doing weekly concerts, and we've got 8 of them up at this point with recordings. So feel free to go check those out. And of course, once everything settles down, we'd love to see you at a show at some point. So we're doing those on Facebook Live every Sunday at 3:00. So we'll hope to see you there. And Hugo, thanks again.
All right. Thank you so much, Eric. Definitely we will have links to everyone's social media, all of their accounts. Pete, why don't you go ahead and tell us what you've got going on?
Yeah, again, my band Kowa just released an EP this last month titled Play It Again. And you can download that at Kowa, that's KOWA.bandcamp.com, or listen to it on all the different online music platforms. Our Instagram account is Kowa Sounds, that's KOWA Sounds. And then also I'm hoping to release some music of my own coming up here pretty soon under the name Slippery People, and my Instagram handle for that is Slippery People Music.
Right on. All right, guys. Thank you so much. Thanks again for taking the time today to talk to us
Thanks,
about your
Hugo.
interpretations of art, and hopefully we'll see you all real soon.
Sounds great.
Take care, guys.
Bye.